And I'm very happy to introduce tonight Mike Allen. Mike is host of the podcast Amazing Tales from Off and On Connecticut's Beaten Path. It is one of the top 5% of all podcasts in the United States. And that's quite remarkable. Mike has previously presented at the library on P.T. Barnum and also about a very interesting murder case in Brookfield, which was very fascinating. Prior to his podcasting, Mike was the on-air radio news director at I-95 FM and its sister station 940 AM before becoming press secretary for the Danbury mayor. During a subsequent 25-year corporate career, he worked, lived, and traveled internationally, specializing in public speaking, communications, and marketing before retiring. He's lived in Connecticut for more than 50 years and currently resides in Danbury. Please give a nice warm welcome to Mike Allen.
Ellen, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this evening. I appreciate the introduction and the invitation. I love the town of Bethel, as a matter of fact. I always come back here, drive down Main Street, drive around P.T. Barnum Square, which I think ought to be called P.T. Barnum Triangle, but that's me. It's just a great town with a lot of history and fabulous. So glad to be back here. I always laugh when the introduction happens and I hear the word retired, because I'm doing anything but retirement now, and I love it. I'm happier than I ever was at any other part of my career, podcasting and being able to come out here and meet people and talk to you about local history and whatnot is just the highlight of my life. So it's been great. We're going to talk about something today. I usually talk about local history. And when I say local, I mean, I'd love to talk about a Bethel story, a Brookfield story. This one will technically be a New Milford story, but it's international. It's got international intrigue. It's an amazing story when you hear all the details. And let me tell you, it takes twists and turns. It's like a magician. Just when you think you've got it figured out where that quarter is, you find it coming out behind the ear and you're like, how'd that happen? And it's a lot of twists and turns on this one. So I'm just going to jump right into it because really, at the end of the day, there's only a couple of questions you need to answer. The problem is you're not going to be able to answer them. That's the trouble. So what we're going to talk about first is this woman named Florence Chandler Maybrick. And Florence was married to a guy, as you're going to find out, in England, named James Maybrick. And the question was, first question, we'll examine this, was James Maybrick Jack the Ripper? Question number two will be, did she kill him? And there's a lot of question about that. She went to jail for a number of years for having done so, but whether she actually did it or not, you'll see this gets a little bit into the weeds, but we'll keep it up here. And then we're going to spend some time. You know that New Milford is, by the way, the largest town space-wise in the state of Connecticut. It's huge. If you start the base down by the Brookfield border and drive all the way up to Gaylordsville, where she lived, it can take you 45 minutes, depending on how the lights are and everything else. But it's a big town. She was in the Gaylordsville section, almost in Kent. So if you know your geography around here, way up north in New Milford. And at the end, happy to answer any questions that I possibly can. So who was Jack the Ripper? Well, Jack the Ripper was a very interesting fellow who murdered at least 5 women. May have been a few more. We're not quite sure because nobody's ever been charged and convicted of being Jack the Ripper. So we don't know who Jack the Ripper was, but these were some of the sketches that occurred in the 1880s in London where these murders occurred. And supposedly he had a bit of a shuffle type of walking gait, had trouble walking. That's what eyewitnesses said who saw him, or who they think was Jack the Ripper. But again, Scotland Yard never never charged anybody with it. So what do we know about Jack? Well, we know that the 5 women who were killed were all what we might call ladies of the night. And this happened in London's notoriously seedy at the time East End, which is where that sort of behavior occurred. And, quite frankly, I hate to put it this way, but the police didn't put much priority on the murder of prostitutes as they might, like a so-called upstanding citizen. It was over a 10-week period in 1888. Started, happened, ended. Just like that, 135 years ago. Now, 3 of the victims had their intestines and other bodily organs removed and placed on the outside on their body. The other 2 that didn't had similar wounds in the intestinal area, but didn't actually have their intestines removed. For what reason, we have no idea. Again, nobody's been charged or convicted of this. And the feeling was at the time, there was a lot of speculation, as you can imagine, must be a doctor, somebody who knows their way around a knife and intestines and all this. It had to have been, or at least somebody who knows about sharp edges and knives. And, people were speculating left and right. The crazy part was that the police announced that they were getting letters from Jack the Ripper, sort of taunting them, and that the letters were coming from all over England. Not just one city, not just one place, they were all over. And quite frankly, a lot of people said, well, that's just not happening. That's a hoax. They're just saying that because nobody was being arrested. So they figured this was the police trying to kind of cover things up. This is one of the postcards that they received. Now, the reason we have this postcard was sold on eBay. And so I swiped a copy of it from online. But what I'm going to tell you later, so this is a little bit of an advanced view. The police held on to all their files for 100 years after the murders. They finally released them a couple decades ago. And you're going to find out how that plays into everything. But this was they finally released the letters. And there's a lot of clues in these letters, but I'm going to read you. It's a little bit, unsavory what you're about to see, but beware, there is 2 women I want here. They are bastards, and I mean to have them. My knife is still in good shape. It is a student's knife, and I hope you like the half of kidney. I am Jack the Ripper. Now, half a kidney was found on one of the women. And the troubling part about these letters and some of the other things that I'm going to show you later is that the knowledge conveyed in them was only known to Jack the Ripper and the police. All right, now it's not, this is the 1880s. They didn't have what we have today, DNA testing and everything other than have cameras to see who came into the post office. That's how it happened. So the primary suspect became this guy, Aaron Kosminski. He was from Poland, 23 years old, a barber in the East End, and they said, yep, he's the guy. That was the whisper campaign, not the police saying this. And he remained a chief suspect for a long time until Scotland Yard released their documents. And when they released the documents, they released a horde of investigators who dove into these papers and came up with some of them kind of harebrained theories, but one we're going to share with you is the one that a lot of people think this guy got it right. Before we do that, who was Florence Chandler Maybrick? I wish I could say she was a Connecticut native because that would make it even more interesting, but she ended her life here, the last 2-3 decades of her life, but she was not born here. She was born down south. And Florence was a very good-looking woman, and in 1862 in Mobile, Alabama, she became Florence Chandler, and she was the daughter of her mother, and as you're about to find out, she never met her father. But we'll get to that in just a second. Her father was William. He was the mayor of Mobile. Unfortunately, he would die before she's born. Her brother was a guy named Holbrook, and between the two of them later in life, you'll find that they inherited 1,000,000 acres of land because her mother goes on after several marriages and has just a ton of money and bought these 1,000,000 acres, gave it to Florence and Holbrook. So you figure, well, they're set now for the rest of their life. It's, it's a done deal. There's no problem here. Well, the mother was named Carrie. She was sort of a socialite of sorts, very proper, prim and proper Southern lady. Her first husband died under mysterious circumstances, as did her second. And mysterious, you can draw your own conclusions, but William fell ill, and Carrie was tending to him in his bed. And she barred others from coming in, which was viewed as very suspicious. She never got charged with anything, but nevertheless, how come he didn't let anybody come in and see him? She was pregnant, and at 8 months pregnant, her husband dies. Her second husband, Frank DuBarry, was actually a very prominent member of the U.S. Navy. He was high-ranking, and they went on a sailing trip together out in the Atlantic Ocean, and he dies. And the ship's captain says, well, because he's so high-ranking, we need to take him back in, do an autopsy, make sure that, nothing is foul here, and plus he needs a proper naval burial. And she stepped up and said, no, he always told me that as a Navy man, he wanted to be buried at sea. And so that's what they did. His body was discarded at sea, never was tested. We don't know why and how he died. Husband number 3 was a baron, and this is where she made most of her money. She became a baroness, Baroness von Roke. He divorced her after 6 years, and I've always maintained that's because he found out what happened to the first 2, and so he wanted to get out while the going was good. But nevertheless, well, that's what happened with Carrie. Now, all this happened to Florence. I mean, she saw all this happening until she became 17 years old, 1879, and they're going to go on a boat ride. Now, as you saw, she was born in Mobile, but moved up to Norfolk, Virginia, which was in the time, in the late 1800s, this was a huge cotton trading area. The huge cotton trading area in England was in Liverpool. So you used to have boats going back and forth between Norfolk and Liverpool all the time. And this is the boat they were on going from Norfolk over to Liverpool. She's 17 years old. She's on the boat with her mom and her brother. She meets this guy named James Maybrick. Now, James Maybrick is 41 years old, 24 years older than she is. And the scandal of the ride is that they go into his room, not to emerge until the boat docks. And when it docks, they come out and say they are engaged to be married. Now, if you stop and think about the dates, and I personally don't do this nearly enough, but 1879, this is technically less than 100 years after the Revolutionary War, where America had kicked out the British, and here's a British guy marrying an American. And that didn't go over so well with everybody in Britain, because he's going to find out he's pretty high up there in terms of economics and whatnot. Why would you be marrying an American after all this? Well, let's take a look at James and see what we can find out about him, because he's quite an interesting character that Florence ended up with. He was in the cotton trade. That's why he was on the boat going from Norfolk back to Liverpool. And he was so wealthy that he was one of the most wealthy men in Liverpool, England. So he was doing very, very well for himself. But he had a couple of drawbacks, but we'll get to that in a second. His brothers, he had 4 brothers. 2 of them we're going to focus on, Michael and Edwin. Michael was an entertainer. He was a singer. He went around, England. He was in London all the time, singing, dancing, entertaining for people. He was great. Edwin was trying to make it in the cotton business, not doing quite as well as his older brother, but hoping to make his way in there. So the other 2 really don't play much of a role in this story. Well, the problem for James, he had a couple of bad habits, shall we say. One of them was adultery. He had multiple mistresses. One woman alone in London, he had 5 children with, 2 of whom were born after he had married. So you can see his idea of, a moralistic relationship or monogamy was, out the window. The other problem he had, which was pretty serious, was he was a drug addict. So he actually had 2 drugs that he liked more than any other. One was arsenic, and you might say, geez, arsenic, doesn't they kill you? Well, arsenic was used to fight malaria. It also, in the right dose, has the effect of Viagra. And so he used it for that. And what he learned to do was to keep the dose just at the right amount where it wouldn't kill you. And he was able to build up a tolerance so he could use it without dying. So that was number one. And while he was playing around with arsenic, he tried another one called strychnine, which you may have heard of. And strychnine, when you mix it with arsenic, apparently gives you a high, something approaching cocaine. So he was quite well versed in all of these things: mistresses, drugs, and cotton. So that's where he came off. And Florence is having to deal with this, and he's so much older, and it just was not obviously a marriage made in heaven. So we come back to that question: did Florence kill her husband? Well, he actually, after many, many affairs, she finally goes out and has one, which they call a revenge affair. She just wanted to make a statement, and she went with one of his colleagues in the cotton business. In those days, the social norm was, unfortunately, well, we kind of expect men to do that. This doesn't mean anything, but if a woman does an affair, oh my God, what have we, come to? And an adulteress, and put the red letter on her, on her chest. And so this was the problem, was they found out that Florence had had this affair, and her reputation goes down the tubes. And meanwhile, he's doing whatever he wants and getting away with it. So that you could see she could get a little angry about that, right? And he comes down finally too ill to keep going, and he's in bed. And does this sound familiar? She's nursing him in his bed, and what happens? He dies. So now this is very interesting how this is going to play out. Well, he was declared dead due to arsenic poisoning, but there's only one problem with that. They took his body from his house to a nearby hotel, and they performed a rather quick and maybe not as thorough autopsy as they should have. They described his stomach as looking like a pharmacist's waste basin. All right, they had so many drugs in there, and they could only really find a trace of arsenic. So you might say, well, then why did they say he died of arsenic poisoning? We'll come back to that. Michael and Edwin were in the house when he died. They're the ones who actually notified police. And what they did was they chloroformed Florence, locked her in a side room, scattered arsenic bottles around the house, and then did the cosmetic stand with, now I don't know if you know this story. This is an interesting one. Fly paper, in the old days, we used to have fly paper to kill flies that they come and stick on it, and then they die, and they were killed by arsenic. Arsenic was in the fly paper. If you took that same fly paper, which a lot of women did in the late 1800s in England, and put it in a bowl of water, the white arsenic would rise to the top, and you could skim it off and put it on your face as a cosmetic, which is what Queen Victoria did all the time. And it was the in thing to have a white face. You may remember that time period. That's the time period we're talking about. So they had this set up. They just made it look like she was using arsenic all the time. And we're again going to come back to this again. When police arrived, Michael implicated Florence, and she's responsible for it. And when she came out, she was groggy and she gave an incoherent statement, so they arrested her. They said, yeah, this must have been it. She was caring for him. The 2 brothers said so. Off she goes to jail. So the question now becomes, was James Maybrick, in fact, Jack the Ripper? Why do we think this? Why would we know this? Well, a lot of this just came out a few decades ago, which is what makes this very intriguing. But one is his diary and one is his pocket watch. And I use the word his with some reservation. The diary was found under the floorboards of the room where he died in the 1990s. And it was signed May 3rd, 1889, that I give my name that all know of me, so history do tell what love can to a gentleman born. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. And that's what this says right here. This is where it's signed off. Now, nowhere in there does it say James Maybrick, but it was underneath his floorboards. He died 4 days after this was signed. He was in no shape to write a diary input. This was dozens and dozens of pages. All right. He was not well enough to do that 4 days before he died. 4 days after this, he just was not in shape to do that. He was bedridden. So this is the diary. The other thing that came out was his pocket watch, supposedly. And on the pocket watch were scratched in there, J. Maybrick, I am Jack, and the initials of 5 victims. The problem with this is that investigators have determined that, in fact, the pocket watch was from that era. The scratching, they're absolutely certain, did occur in the 1880s. They could tell by an extensive analysis of the coating that was on the watch and how the scratch marks were made. And they determined there's no way that could have been done more recently. They didn't have the same sort of coatings. You know, it was just would have had to have been such an elaborate hoax that it just was impossible. Anyway, that doesn't mean that James Maybrick did the scratching, right? It was just his pocket watch. And again, he's bedridden and dying as people are putting things maybe in the floorboards and maybe putting his watch around. Why would they want to frame him? Well, now we get to the fun part. So this book, They All Love Jack. Why is it named They All Love Jack? Because I originally thought, oh, it's Jack the Ripper, right? We all like Jack the Ripper. No, it had nothing to do with Jack the Ripper. James's brother, Michael, the singer, the entertainer, had a very popular song that he performed called They All Love Jack. And he went around the countryside doing it. Now, Bruce Robinson, who wrote this book, is the investigator who did what most observers believe is the true best analysis of the information that Scotland Yard finally released 100 years into this. To sum it up, because some details are going to come here, but to sum it up, he said Michael Maybrick was Jack the Ripper, the singer, the entertainer, not James Maybrick. And now, why does he say that? Michael, it turns out, they know, hated the Masons, the group, the organization, the Masons. Even though his brother and his father had been Masons, he didn't like them. He didn't like their leadership. He didn't like their style. And he was willing to do anything he could to embarrass the Masons because he thought they were horrible for society. Well, it turns out Scotland Yard, all of their leadership was Masons. And when you look at the letters, numerous references to Masonic imagery, Masonic rituals, everything about the Masons, and castigating them. This was all in there, but it wasn't released until 100 years after the murders. He claimed in these letters to be perfecting an undetectable poison, which is interesting because, again, they said it was arsenic, but they really weren't sure. With James bedridden, according to the book now, this is not me saying this, is the book saying it, he says that Michael set up Florence. You remember the chloroforming and everything else? Well, they said that he convinced Edwin to consistently increase his undetectable poison, that he would go over to the house to visit his brother, allegedly, get her out of the room, increase the undetectable poison, and that Edwin was continuing to basically kill their brother. Why? Because what would they get? They would get his inheritance, which is one of the things they were very upset that Florence was going to get. They started a whisper campaign. Apparently, there's notes that show that Michael went to Scotland Yard and to others and started saying, my brother James is Jack the Ripper. And he was, so ill and everything else. And they figured, well, he was a Mason, so there's no way Scotland Yard's going to arrest him because after all, it's prostitutes and he's ill and they'll just let it go. Bruce Robinson, the author, suggested it was James who wrote the diary because he knew all the details because he was Jack the Ripper and he had access to the house and could put it under the floorboards. And that's what he did. And he also, when police showed up, when I said that before he implicated her, the key thing that he said was she had found out that he was Jack the Ripper and was going to kill. Final part of this, which is very interesting, there is an affidavit from a draft dodger in the 100-year-old documents who said, I was standing outside a bar and I overheard Michael and Edwin Maybrick conspiring to kill their brother. And that's in, again, the documents. Now, if it was just that, I'd say, well, maybe he's trying to get off another, problem. But there's so much information in there that supports this, that this really looks like the case. Now, if this is all true, then Florence did not kill her husband, and her husband was not Jack the Ripper. But Scotland Yard, even on this information, hasn't made any statement or made any claims. So now back to Florence. She's been arrested. She has to go to court. And this was a absolute clown court. The judge, it was his last case before they made him leave the bench. He was probably Alzheimer's in the 1880s. He was losing it clearly. He was a misogynist, right? So she gets into court and he's making statements like, if she was an adulteress, of course she could be a murderer. And he's making claims about the case, and the attorneys are having to say, excuse me, Honor, a moment, and come up to the bench and say, no, that's not what happened. It was like this, and they were having to correct the judge. He ends up getting committed, died in an insane asylum 2 years after this case, and this was the last case he tried. Now, okay, that's pretty bad. Her own attorney didn't even mention James's infidelity in front of the jury, again, as if, well, that's two-tier standards here. A part that I just shake my head and can't believe this next one is the jury was not sequestered. And they would go out after the day's events, go over to the pub across the street. The press would follow them and they'd sit there and chat about the case. I mean, could you imagine that happening with any of the great court cases we've got going on right now? I mean, this is what was happening. So as you can imagine, the press was convinced this, and the jury was convinced that she had done it. All the evidence seemed to point to her. The verdict was 45 minutes later, and she was sentenced to hang for the murder of her husband. Well, this created quite an uproar on both sides of the Atlantic, and about 500,000 British subjects wrote to the Queen saying, you cannot hang this woman. This is a travesty. And in fact, the wives of the US cabinet members wrote to the Queen as well. So this became quite an international saga. She ends up commuting the sentence, which in the time a woman was expected to live 20 years, starting at the age that Florence was at. So they made it a 20-year sentence. They released her after 15 and said, we're letting you go back to your home country, the US, but please, we don't want to hear any more about this. So no books, don't talk about it. Let's just let it be. Okay, so she goes back, and at the New York harbors, and you've all been on the west side of Manhattan and see where the boats were. And I remember in my day, that used to be a much busier place than it is today, but boats were coming in there all the time before they moved over to Brooklyn. And the reception she got was the largest reception ever in US history at a dock, including heads of state, the Pope. I mean, she drew a larger crowd than anybody coming into the New York City docks. So what does she do? She immediately sets out on a speaking tour, which she wasn't supposed to do. But she was making money. She's going around telling her story to anybody who would listen. She's traveling the country, and it kept going for 5 years. She was living in a pretty swanky Chicago hotel. Life was good. Her brother, though, had died, and she wasn't quite sure what was going on with the million acres, but she figured, she was pretty confident she'd be able to do something with that. So life at this point now, after all that went on in England, is fairly good. Well, the problem was that the public lost interest in the story. So her revenue stream of going around and talking about this case after about 5 years, nobody really cared anymore. So she wasn't making any money, and she had to move out of that swanky Chicago hotel to the local Salvation Army. So that was a problem. And then she turned to this guy that she had met at the hotel who was an attorney and said, look, I've got this land down there. He goes, tell me more. So she says, look, it's in my name and Holbrook's name, and it's, in 3 different states, but I don't even know where to start. So he says, let me do you a little favor. I'll go check this out. Comes back to her, says, you got 2 really big problems. You owe so much in back taxes, and you don't have that money. And worse than that, you've got squatters all over that million acres, and the legal hassle to get them off is going to bankrupt you. I mean, there's not enough money, even if you could claim, and they couldn't find all the papers. Holbrook had kind of messed it up. And so he just finally said, look, I think you ought to just walk away from it, because if you try and claim title to this, people are going to bring you into court on different things, and you have no money to defend yourself. So she ends up having to walk away from this. And now she has to make a very big decision. What do I do with my life? What have I got? And here's a woman who had everything, right? Wealth and prestige, and then, of course, the whole situation with court. So she makes a decision that she's going to change her life, make a huge change in her life. And there was a woman from Brookfield who she had kept in touch with since she got back, a playwright. And this playwright had known about her since she got back on the boat, had kept in touch with her throughout her 5 years, and was always there for her. And so Florence, who's feeling like she doesn't really have a friend in the world, doesn't know where to turn, turns to Cora. She decides, I'm not going to be Florence Maybrick anymore, the wife or widow of James Maybrick. I'm going to go back to my regular first name of Chandler, my maiden name. And so she becomes now Florence Chandler, and she decides to come to Connecticut. She contacts Cora, the playwright, and said, Cora, I need a job. So they find her a job, and this was pretty funny, in Gaylordsville on a poultry farm. Henrietta Banwell, who was a friend of Cora's and could keep a good secret, said, yeah, I can, use a hand around the farm. Well, it didn't take long until they realized Florence was not a farmhand. She was not very good at it, and both sides decided, let's just stop this. And so what ends up happening is she says, look, I'm going to do this for you, because she was still getting gifts and some money sent to her and letters all the time. So she said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to set up 2 identities. I will be your Florence Maybrick, so stuff will come to me, Cora, as Florence Maybrick. I will switch everything around and put it into an account for you, Florence Chandler, and then you can have access to the money and do everything. And so they decided this was great. I mean, one of the gifts she got was a lifetime subscription to the New York Times, as an example. Somebody said, you deserve this. So now let's look at her time in Gaylordsville. And for those of you who know the territory, so this is where Route 7 comes up and goes across the Housatonic. And, right after that, you turn in here, and this is one way up, and this is another way up. Well, this road here goes up to, and you can't really see it on this map, Old Stone Road. What I want to point out while we're on this map is this is now the South Kent School. If you know the Kent School in Kent, in downtown Kent, you may not know there's the South Kent School, which is a branch of it down here in Southern Kent. This golf club was not in existence when Florence was living there. And in fact, the Kent School wasn't in existence when Florence first moved there. So what Florence moved into here was a vast nothingness, just forest and land as far as you could walk, as far as you could see. So this was Old Stone Road. This is the only known photograph remaining of her house, which no longer exists, unfortunately, that was there on Old Stone Road. So she had to put down $75 for the land, a third of an acre, and $2,000 to have the place built, the 3-room shanty there that she was living in, and that was in 1919. What she did in Gaylordsville was really a couple of things. First of all, she became known as the cat woman of Gaylordsville. Why? Because she had 70 cats. And this was just, you could imagine with her 3-room abode, how well that got through. She would go down to the general store, which was down by the Hoosnick, and it was, you know, about a 1.5 mile walk down, 1.5 mile back, good exercise. She'd go down every day, get some food for herself, some milk for the cats, and she'd get her New York Times while she was there. But the entire time she did this, she didn't let people know who she was. And her neighbors had no idea who she was. So this worked out for her very well. And the neighbors, as far as they knew, there's just some eccentric old lady living there with a bunch of cats, and that's great. Well, then one of her neighbors who had been particularly helpful to her, Genevieve Austin, she was so good to her, she said, I'm going to give her my fancy black dress. It was one of the few really nice things she still had left. And when she was touring the country, she would wear this dress when she gave talks. And she had it in Chicago, and she had it dry cleaned. It was in a box, and she gave it to Genevieve. Well, the problem was, she leaves, she goes back to her house. When Genevieve opens it up, a receipt pops out that says Florence Maybrick. Now she's going, wait a second, I thought she was Florence Chandler. And then they start, you know, she talks to her husband. They're like, wasn't she the one, you know, who was in England, you know, blah, blah, blah. So they have a niece who works at the New York Public Library, and they contact her and said, you know anything about this? And she said, yeah, this is the same woman. Don't know if you need to be careful or not, but you know, gave them the scoop. Anyway, she was harmless, and they said, look, we're, you know, between themselves, they said, we're just going to keep this secret. We're not going to tell anybody. And after Genevieve died, her husband Tom gave the dress to the New Milford Historical Society, where it resides to this day. They don't always have it on display, but when they do, it's worth to go up there and just say, hey, that was Florence's dress. Well, now, like I said, when she first moved in there, the South Kent School was not there. And it was time for the South Kent School to be built. And so she wandered on up there and made some friends, and particularly with Sister Clara. She was the house mother and had a few odd jobs that Florence could do, nothing major, but just really to have an excuse to slip her $5 every week so she would have some money for food and other things. But Florence would show up, and you see her right there doing this at one of the sporting events, just hanging out and rooting on the kids, and the kids loved her. They would do, you know, errands for her, bring her firewood, do all this stuff. They just loved her. So that was seemingly going very well until Sister Clara developed cancer and died. And so Florence goes to the headmaster, rather audacious, by the way, and said, look, you have this very small plot that's a cemetery, and it's really only for the administrators of the South Kent School who were buried there. Would you mind, when I go, if I could be buried next to Sister Clara? And he granted her wish and said, okay, we'll do that. That'll be fine. So these are actually, that is her headstone. This is the library, and this was the original stake in her at her gravesite. She was at her home when a utility lineman was doing some work on Old Stone Road, and she suffered a stroke. He found her face down outside her house, got her inside, contacted some people who said, yeah, we'll help in the South Kent School. The nurse there set up some medical attention for her. So they got her stabilized, but, you know, obviously she had, you know, had suffered a big medical problem. The final days, one of the things that happened was there was a school official And he and his daughter would come by every day with milk for the cats. And they would leave a couple bottles of milk and they would take the empties that she would leave there. And she really became a recluse at this point. Nobody really saw her, but they knew she was using the milk because she'd leave the empties out there. And one day in 1941, they went there and there weren't empties, the milk was full. So it was clear that she hadn't come out to get the milk for her cats, and they went in and found she had passed away. So now they're going to hold a funeral, and this story makes the front page of the New York Times. And the New York Times reporter who covered her case in London came and covered her funeral in Gaylordsville. And on the way out the door, he said to the headmaster, by the way, she was once considered the most beautiful woman in Liverpool. So that was more or less the end of the road for Florence. Her house collapsed in 1983. What she did that's sort of lived on as her legacy is the pachysandra that she grew. And she planted it to the point where there's so much of it that on Google Maps, when you go on Old Stone Road, you'll see the pachysandra. That's Google Maps, and that's the pachysandra. This is it from ground level. And what happens is, locals come and take cuttings, and it's just a sort of a tradition in New Milford. Like every town has theirs, that was theirs. What about old Michael and Aaron? What happened to them? Well, Michael went on, he became a politician, and he went to an island off the British coast and was elected mayor 4 times running. So he did fine. Nobody ever accused him of anything. Aaron, never accused, never tried. He went on his way and continued cutting hair in East London until he died. And I also like to shout out to Ron Shersha, because Ron is a New Milford resident who took up the cause of Florence because her memory was, the memory of her was starting to fade. And he took it upon himself to make sure that this woman's legacy and her, life in Gaylordsville is always remembered. This is just a picture of him with the mayor. They were doing a proclamation on the 80th anniversary of her passing, just to remind people of Florence. So I always like to give a little shout out to Ron. So that's the end of the scheduled presentation. I am happy to answer any questions that I can, except who's Jack the Ripper.
No, but you're not gonna answer.
I wish I knew. I honestly, no, I've got to tell you, it's pretty compelling, this Michael Maybrick angle. And I still don't know why Scotland Yard held on to the information for 100 years. I mean, it's not the JFK assassination. I mean, there's differences here. And I've not heard a really sufficient reason why they held on. Yes. Yeah, I've not heard a good reason.
What I've read of English aristocracy, a baron is really high, so it might well have been on the level of the JFK. The police were below a baron, so they aren't going to look into it.
It's a good point.
Barons could buy out their way out of so many things. In English history, it gets pretty ugly.
Mm-hmm.
Misogynist.
Yeah, well, that's true too, yes.
It does
That's
not-
an
it
interesting
doesn't
point.
surprise me that non-stop barons would have done anything. Especially, they wouldn't go against Masons either. But the aristocracy, the barons and baronesses were. After that, they become a lord. I don't remember exactly, but, or maybe even, no, the barons are higher than the lords even.
Yeah, I was going to actually do some looking into this and I forgot. I don't know if anything on Princess Di is still secret. What happened in France to her. I don't know whether they, I'm sure there is some secret stuff there that we don't know, but, but officially, I don't know if they've released the papers on that even. So I don't know how Scotland Yard operates. I'm not an expert on that by any stretch of the imagination. Ellen.
A long time ago, that one of the royal princes in Britain was Jack the Ripper. They had a lot of information about one of the princes in Queen Victoria's son, Jack the Ripper.
I've heard that too. I wouldn't call myself a Jack the Ripper. I mean, there are what they call ripperologists who actually, I mean, there are websites and Facebook pages. If you're interested in this, you can get inundated. In fact, I was a little concerned because, I have this presentation that I've talked about around the area a couple times. And the big article came out on one of the social media sites about 8 weeks ago, saying we found out who it is now. And it's this woman whose great 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 grandfather worked on the case, and she was able to piece together medical information on this guy who had been apparently a suspect. And there were 4 or 5 people with the same name. And when they finally figured out which one it was, went after his medical information. He walked with a shuffle. He was put into a mental institution. He was abusing people and hurting them with sharp edge. I'm not sure if it was a knife or what it was that he was using. And after they institutionalized him, the murder stopped. Was that him? I don't know. That's the problem. And so this woman claims absolutely. Bruce Robinson stands by his version of events. There are so many people out there. But this is the one that created a lot of headlines because of the the Florence angle. Yes.
The drugs that James Maybrick, that he was addicted to and used, I don't think I've ever heard anyone use those things as a drug for enjoyment or whatever. And it was interesting because he supposedly might have been Jack the Ripper or his brother possibly or whatever. And I mean, you can kill people with that. And usually you hear stories of people who were killed by arson, poison, strychnine, whatever, so that was kind of interesting. Was it a common thing? Or was he very unique in the sense that he was addicted to arsenic and strychnine?
What I can tell you that I know is that chemistry was evolving in the 1800s in Europe. And it started essentially in the German-Swiss area along the Rhine River. That's where, modern organic chemistry began. There was a lot of high society use of different substances. Poisons, they kill rats and kill other things, do have, I used to work for a chemical company in my corporate years, and there are poisons that, given in the right doses, create a euphoric sense. And so, for humans. So if somebody had figured out that strychnine and arsenic going together does this, I mean, I don't know. I've never, I do have one medical person in our family. I suppose I should take this up with them, but I couldn't tell you for sure. But I do know there was a lot of there was a lot of cocaine use. In the 1900s, particularly the 1900s, high society, all the time. Yeah.
And it was interesting that letter said, I'm working on an undetectable poison, and it's like, have the drug addict brother, and then the other suspect, the other brother, and working on the poison and the uniqueness of the drugs he used. It was, yeah.
That's why, and particularly, I mean, the diary has been authenticated at, in terms of the time, the ink that was used, the paper that was used. It's not like somebody did this in, 1980, it was from the 1880s.
So I'm trying to understand why Florence got such a great welcome in New York City. Was it recognized around the world that she had been kind of abuse of justice? And then why did Victoria not recognize that and do better?
My guess and the speculation is, first of all, yes, it was widely considered to be a kangaroo court. Victoria, who never commuted sentences, obviously felt her back was against the wall. She was a very proud woman, and she pretty much said, look, if this is what I dictated that's going to happen, for her to go against that and commute the sentence was remarkable.
So it was her police that she had to stand behind, it was her royalty, essentially her royal government. Stand as one. Okay.
Right. Right. What I still am kind of puzzled by is how Michael Maybrick got out of all this. You know, this is that's pretty slimy to have, you know, ended up being a mayor on an island off Britain and never taking any heat for any of this, even though his brother was at the center of all this. Yeah,
So.
yeah, well, that's,
You're away with it, they're not gonna investigate him either.
no, true.
He set her up, the brothers set her up pretty well.
It looks like that's exactly what happened, and so I mean, I don't think for a second that Florence killed James. That's my personal opinion.
But the Ripper killings could be completely unrelated, right?
Right.
And it could have just all been a setup because no one knew who the Ripper was.
Exactly.
So,
Well, except that, I mean, keep in mind the diary entries, along with the letters that were written, had information that only the police and Jack the Ripper knew.
letters.
Yeah. So it couldn't be like you know, wrote it, because I wouldn't know any of the details, but whoever wrote it was probably Jack the Ripper. So the question is, if James couldn't write it because he's on his deathbed, did his brother Michael write it to set him up and cover his tracks? Say, well, it was always my brother. But yeah, it's just, there's too many, like I said, it's like a magic show. You think the quarter's coming out here, but it's not.
And the word is so bizarre that it's hard. It seems a little far-fetched that someone would create this bizarre murders in order to pin it on someone. It wouldn't have to be bizarre murders, it could just be murders normally, right? I mean, it wouldn't have to be like
Cutting out intestines and everything, going to those lengths. I agree with you. I think that, you know, if you follow the mindset that it was Michael trying to embarrass Scotland Yard, then conceivably, I suppose you could make the case that he's going to go over the top, make it horrendous, and just see and be able to say, see how incompetent they are.
He could have been using drugs too.
and yeah, I suppose, and make the front page and make this a big story.
Which it was.
In one hand, so they can go off and be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a pendulum, someone else.
I have a question about Gaylordsville and the fact that Florence Chandler Maybrick had 70 cats.
Yep.
Wasn't important
When
back then.
Yeah, right. And where she lived, so driving up Route 7, going to Kent Falls, whatever, did that as a child with, you know, family and stuff like that. I remember there was a pet cemetery up
Mhm.
there for years, and I wondered, was there any connection between her and whoever opened and started this pet cemetery?
It was a crematorium for animals, the Balmoral
Yeah.
facility on Route 7. I don't know of any connection there, but what I can tell you is, again, there was no golf course there. There was no South Kent school there. It was farmland, and farmers had cats.
Yeah.
They had lots of cats. So she would attract them with milk, and cats come when you give them milk.
So close. Where, I mean, I think you still see the sign. I think it's still
Yeah, you
there.
can still see it. It's in the
Yeah.
structure itself's in pretty sad shape.
Yeah, but it's very close to where she
Yeah.
was.
Yeah, it's not
What
far.
year did she die again?
She died in 1941. Yeah. Actually, I hadn't stopped to think about that. Yes, ma'am.
How Scotland Yard never accused anyone, was there a consensus of public opinion as to who it was? Did people at the time think it was James or think it was Michael?
At the time, they thought during the court case for Florence, James was sort of targeted, but the problem was, it's like anything else, not all the public went along with it because some of the public was focused on this judge, who they said this was a kangaroo court, and you can't believe anything coming out of it. So, you know, this poor woman's getting railroaded. So not sure we believe this. Again, it was Aaron Kosminski who was sort of the odds-on, suspect for the longest time. And then when they released everything, they were like, well, Aaron's not even, in these papers. I mean, this is ridiculous. So his name has, gone away. But the problem is now today, just like I said, 8-10 weeks ago, there was another article. This is happening in the British tabloids as well. So when you ask, is there consensus? My understanding is there's not, and the people in Britain are just as confused as we are here. I mean, there are people who claim they know and, blah, 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 but bring the evidence, bring the proof. Very mysterious.
You ever taken the Jack the Ripper tour?
No, no. Been to London a lot of times, but I've never took the tour.
Chaperoning it with high school and college age kids. There was my little bundle of them, really wanted to do it. There was no way I was gonna do it. First of all, it is, East London.
Well, East London's a
Go
little,
there.
yeah. So
I talked about, I take to the British Museum and showing them the real mummies instead of fake dead.
usually works. So
Question would be, if anybody has ever taken it, what did they say on that tour?
yeah, I don't know.
I'm just curious, did they do any kind of handwriting analysis? Or that was not
That
Science.
science, if you want to call it that, came along years later. But nobody, to my knowledge, I mean, Michael was never identified as a suspect, so they wouldn't have taken the handwriting analysis from him. The diary, as I'm told, it looks a lot like his handwriting. Whether or not it's exact match or not, I don't know, or if anybody's done that.
Today. Look at these different papers.
If you want my answer, yes. Yeah, I think they could, and why they haven't, I don't know. Or maybe somebody has and they're not talking, I don't know. I know that the diary is in private hands. That's one of the other, it was never turned over. It's not in police custody. It's just like that letter I showed you, the postcard that was, it was sold on eBay. So a lot of these things are in private hands now, and how they got there, I'm not really sure, but.
Jack the Ripper named himself,
Right,
sending
Right.
letters or whatever, and then brother with that song.
well, and the other thing was the public at the time thought that Jack the Ripper was made up by the tabloids as a way to sell papers, and that they were actually, pushing this way out of, perspective. So, what we look at and say, oh my God, the Jack the Ripper murders, as far as they're concerned, there were 5 murders amongst many others in London that year. And, why are you making such a big deal about this one? But the Florence case certainly played into it.
where her house was.
No, what you're looking at is part of the area. In fact, I should have pointed that out on the opening slide, and unfortunately, let me just see if I can do this. Hold on a second. Gonna try something. If it doesn't work, well, I tried. Does that go back to slide 1? There you go. Okay, wow, that worked. Worked out well. This is Old Stone Road. It's a scenic road, one of those beautiful old roads. And when you come up here, in fact, I would encourage you just go up there, be very careful. It's not a wide road. It's, some people living on it. But when you get up to this part, the 1/3 of the acre, the people who own it, who are requesting anonymity, bought it because they wanted to preserve Florence's place. The Pachysandra right there. You can't miss it. It's the only place that you see this Pachysandra on there. And all I know is that the house was toward the southern end of the property, but that I couldn't tell you exactly where. And then on that last slide, which I can do that because I push 1 and enter and it goes to 1. Now, if I push 40 and enter, I don't know where it's going to go. So the But you saw that wreath that's there. Somebody actually comes and changes that wreath regularly. It's like a little tribute to her, so it's kind of cool just to drive up there and see it and say, wow, this is where she was, and
That's all is somewhere around there.
Yeah, the wreath would be over underneath the word Ripper. Yeah, it's a fun topic. It's and when you think, I mean, she was there for 30 years. 1919 to 1941. Did I do my math right? No, 20 years. I don't remember. I'm sorry. 1820, it was, I'm trying to think, because it was 1888 were the murders. That was 26, I think she was 26 when they happened, so she would have been born in the 1860s, somewhere around Civil War time. So she was probably in her 70s or 80s, somewhere in that time frame.
Which first married, right?
17, she was, and James, her adulterous husband, was 41. Yep. 24 years older.
That's all.
Yeah. And so, people will come up and take cuttings all the time. Kind of a little something in your backyard. Yeah, exactly.
My grandfather had, but because it spreads.
Yes, it's non-native.
That's right.
It's deer.
Yes. One of the few things in my yard that's a deer proof, that's for sure. Any other questions?
There was a comment from the chat.
Yes.
A woman by the name of Elizabeth Ryan wanted to say, I can't tell you how much I enjoy this presentation. Beautifully done, and I agree. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth. I appreciate that. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. And if you're interested, you all know about my podcast that I do. I think, okay, so I don't have to bore you with all those details. Keep listening, have a great time, enjoy. Okay.